Harvest of Shadows. The day dawned with crisp autumn air and a sky so brilliantly blue that it almost hurt to look upon. In the farming village of Maplewick, townsfolk bustled across the central square, finalizing preparations for the annual harvest feast. The air smelled of baking bread, sweet cider, and newly turned earth from the surrounding fields. Laughter and warm conversation braided seamlessly with the distant toll of a single bell from the modest church at the hill's edge. Old Man Bramwell, the village's self-taught fiddler, rosin-dusted bow in hand, plucked at the strings of his instrument while two young boys, twins with strawberry hair, danced around him in delight. Banners of burnt orange and gold rippled from wooden posts, echoing the colors of fallen leaves swirling at everyone's feet. The last wagon load of pumpkins arrived from Barnaby's orchard, each round gourd shimmering with promise. A sense of well-deserved pride and unity filled the air. The harvest had been plentiful: plump apples, golden wheat, tall cornstalks with full ears. Every villager believed this was a reward for a year's worth of toil under the sun. And so, with smiles lighting up every face, the humble farming community prepared for a night of feasting, music, and gratitude. Children scampered between barrels of cider and tables laden with fresh produce. Elderly couples, hands gnarled from decades of tilling the soil, exchanged stories of harvests long past. Families gathered at hand-hewn picnic tables, sampling the thick slices of apple pie that had become something of a legend in Maplewick. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, ribbons of pink and orange swirled overhead, heralding the twilight. The bonfires carefully laid at the square's perimeter flickered to life. Their warm glow chased away the first intimations of the creeping darkness, while the locals continued to set out dishes of roasted squash, honey-glazed carrots, and thick stews. Towering hay bales became seats for the younger folk, who gossiped about rumored ghost stories from the older generation. But the oldest villagers kept an eye on the horizon, as if some intangible presence weighed on their minds. It was the final day of the harvest season, the threshold between reaping and rest. Perhaps they remembered that in years long past, not all harvests had ended so happily. Yet tonight, those stories held no claim on the present. Tonight was celebration, a triumph of life, an exaltation of the simple beauty of the earth's bounty. At the heart of the festivities, Barnaby himself, a broad man with a chestnut beard and forearms as thick as fence posts, lifted a brimming mug of cider. He gave a hearty toast to the villagers, praising the children for their help in the fields, the mothers for their tireless cooking and cleaning, the fathers for their sweat under the summer sun, and the elders for their wisdom that guided each generation's hand. The gathered crowd cheered as he toasted the soil, the sky, and the gentle rains that had blessed Maplewick this season. Stomping feet punctuated his words, while the fiddle's tune grew more excited, dancing through the night air. The swirl of skirts and gleam of polished boots carved jubilant shapes in the flickering firelight. Soon, the entire village was moving, a kaleidoscope of laughter and motion. When the moon finally rose, fat and yellow in the sky, it shone down on a village at its happiest, unaware or perhaps willfully ignorant of the strange hush that settled outside the ring of bonfires. The stars overhead, so many that one could lose count, cast an otherworldly shimmer across the fields. If anyone had been listening closely, they might have heard the faintest whisper in the breeze, as though something ancient and hungry stirred just beyond the glow of the flames. By midnight, the festivities had reached a pleasant exhaustion. New mothers rocked sleeping infants as they slipped away to their homes. Farmhands walked arm in arm with their sweethearts, weaving gently through the labyrinth of half-empty tables. Husbands hoisted leftover pies onto their shoulders, while wives herded giggling children whose teeth were sticky with honey. Songs of thanks gave way to soft lullabies from aging throats. The fields around the village stood dark and quiet, tall silhouettes of corn swaying in the cool wind. One by one, the bonfires were banked for safety, leaving only the largest blaze in the center to guide the last revelers who lingered to chat. Eventually, Barnaby led the final stragglers out of the square, a proud grin on his face for the community that had come together so perfectly. As he latched the gate behind him, the wind murmured through the cornstalks like a sigh. Only moonlight remained to keep a silent vigil. The night deepened, and Maplewick slept, satisfied and unsuspecting. It began quietly, in the darkest hour before dawn. Long, thin strands of fog slipped into the village from the bordering woods, wrapping around fence posts and creeping across the farmland with unnatural purpose. Dew-laden corn leaves drooped as if weighed down by a new, oppressive presence. By the time a faint glow announced the coming sunrise, the once proud cornstalks, wheat fields, and orchard leaves had lost their vibrant color. They hung limp, pallid under the gray sky. Something far worse waited at the heart of these withered plants, slithering masses of darkness that pooled in every furrow and eddy of earth. These were not ordinary shadows cast by the subdued morning sun. Instead, they moved of their own volition in slow, serpentine currents. They whispered among themselves, forming shapes that darted behind trees and snaked around barn corners. One moment they would stretch tall, like silent sentinels. The next, they collapsed into fluid pools and seeped into the farmland. Anyone awake early enough to witness this unearthly display might have believed they were lost in a nightmare. But Maplewick's inhabitants, still lulled by the memory of the previous night's revelry, did not awaken until that sunrise betrayed the horrifying transformation of their fields. "The harvest's gone sour overnight," shouted a panicked voice, echoing across the empty main street. Barnaby was the first to voice it aloud, dropping to his knees by the cornstalks he'd so proudly grown. Now they were husks, pale and cracked, as though years of drought had ravaged them. Similar cries rose elsewhere. A young shepherd discovered that every last blade of grass in the pasture had turned brittle and gray, forcing his sheep to bleat restlessly. The orchard, once radiant with red apples, now bore shriveled, blackened fruit. Fear replaced the merriment of the previous evening as villagers scrambled to find the cause. Some blamed a sudden plague, others blamed foul magic or the wrath of an ancient spirit. But blame gave way to stunned horror once they noticed the flickering shapes, like living silhouettes, darting at the edges of their vision. Each time a villager turned, these shadows vanished, or pretended to vanish, only to slide behind the next tree or slink around the corner of a barn. Children clung to their mothers, while fathers and farmhands pressed pitchforks and hoes into their trembling grips, uncertain against an enemy they couldn't quite see. It felt as though Maplewick had fallen under a curse that no one could comprehend. As the day pressed on, the unnatural shadows began taking bolder action. They no longer seemed content with lurking at the village periphery. Instead, they slipped onto porches and across the dusty streets, drawn to the villagers themselves. One by one, men and women discovered these unsettling shadows clinging to their feet or shoulders, hugging close as if to feed on their very essence. An elderly woman, stooped from years of farm work, felt a cold pressure near her spine. Though she tried to brush it away, it remained, a dark shape that pulsed in tune with her racing heartbeat. She soon grew pale, her breath labored, her eyes hollowed, as if the shadow drained more than mere warmth. Barnaby, reeling from the shock, directed people to the old church. Perhaps, he reasoned, the sanctity of that place could offer protection. A terrified crowd gathered there, while the local priest, Father Ellison, his hair as white as the altar cloth, did his best to calm the rising panic. His prayers vibrated through the church rafters, offering a small solace against the creeping dread. Yet the shadows continued their silent campaign, slithering up the walls of the church, peering in through the stained glass as if trying to seep into every beam of light. Night approached again, and with it, a far deeper terror took hold of Maplewick. People tried to ward their homes with candles, lanterns, and crosses drawn in chalk. Some attempted to burn the withered crops in hopes of driving away whatever evil held sway in the fields. Flickering flames rose from the farmland, sending heavy smoke curling into the sky. The shadows recoiled at first, but soon found new pathways to slip around. Villagers who ventured outside after dark felt these living silhouettes brush against their legs or latch onto their chests, sending icy tendrils crawling along their skin. Over time, afflicted villagers sank into a dull stupor, eyes filming over with a gloss of exhaustion. Their voices turned dry and raspy, their steps dragged, as if every footfall was a struggle. Gone was the lively spirit of the harvest celebration. In its place was a low, desperate moan that echoed in the streets like the calls of the dying. Doors stayed barred through the night, windows latched and covered. Families huddled together, hoping the morning light might banish the malevolent presence that had overtaken their village. But outside, in the gloom, the shadows multiplied. They fed upon the corners of the darkness, swirling and merging until the entire horizon flickered with shifting shapes. The wind carried faint, nightmarish laughter. The second morning arrived colorless and bleak. Many who had succumbed to the creeping shadows never emerged from their homes. Barnaby forced himself to check on neighbors, stepping hesitantly into each house. There, he found vacant stares and feverish murmurs. Some clutched blankets around their trembling frames, eyes sunken in. Others were lying in crumpled heaps, chest barely moving. Yet the shadows that adhered to them almost seemed thicker, fed by the nights of slow draining. Father Ellison tried every prayer he knew, performing rites and sprinkling holy water on the afflicted. Each time, the shadow quivered, but never fully receded. It seemed to tighten its grip in defiance. Worst of all were the children. The vile shapes often latched around a youngster's tiny waist or shoulders, siphoning away laughter and brightness, leaving only quiet terror. The village well, once central to daily life, became a place of dread. People had begun finding strange black residue at the bottom of buckets, as though tendrils of shadow swam in the water. Anxiety swelled into panic. What if the shadows poison our water, our food? A woman sobbed. No one had a reassuring answer. Barnaby tried to encourage them to stay strong, that daylight might grant relief, but each day's sun seemed weaker than the last. There was a pall over Maplewick, as though the living darkness had set a veil between earth and sky. At sunset of the second day, an oppressive hush blanketed the village. Doors remained double-barred, curtains drawn so tight not a single thread of light was allowed to escape. Parents choked on tears as they rocked feverish children. A stench of decay drifted from the once bountiful fields. The living shadows prowled with new confidence, manifesting in windows and creeping beneath door frames. Barnaby, hardly able to rest, stationed himself by the church's main entrance. A ring of candles provided weak illumination. Father Ellison kneeled nearby, whispering prayers into the gloom. The man of faith looked exhausted. Dark circles marred his eyes, his cheeks hollowed. A small group of villagers lingered behind them, too afraid to be alone. Together, they listened to the tormenting sounds that came from the dark. Faint rustlings, ghostly moans, the scrape of limbs against walls, as if the shadows were learning to manipulate objects. Then, in a single terrifying moment, a gust of wind snuffed out every candle in the church. Pitch-black shapes spilled in through the open door, swirling around the pews, climbing the walls in an inky tide. Each villager felt a cold weight on their chest, pulling at something deeper than blood or breath. A woman screamed, her voice abruptly cut short. A choking hush filled the church as the last sputtering flame died. The night was in agony. Those who still had the strength barricaded themselves wherever they could. Root cellars, back rooms, abandoned barns. But to the living darkness, no barrier seemed impenetrable. One by one, shadows found them. By the time the gray drizzle of dawn arrived, the village's spirit had been siphoned away. A handful of survivors emerged shakily from hiding places, eyes red-rimmed with terror. They wandered down the main street, calling out for loved ones. Doors stood wide open. Windows were shattered. In the orchard, all that remained were twisted branches and rotting fruit. No living soul answered the frantic calls. On the stoops of humble cottages and in alleyways, shriveled husks of what had once been villagers lay, mouths parted in silent screams. Their skin, drained of color, stretched across bones. The final horrible truth was there for all to see. The shadows had not just crippled bodies, they had robbed them of essence, leaving only remnants. Of Barnaby, there was no sign. The big man who had led the festivities days before was simply gone. Perhaps he had stumbled into some final stand, or perhaps the shadows had dragged him into their midnight domain as some sort of grisly prize. Father Ellison was found kneeling at the altar, head bowed. When they tried to move him, his body collapsed in a hollow shell, leaving nothing but echoing robes and bones that rattled with the slightest touch. Maplewick was a ruin of echoes and nightmares, the once thriving farmland reduced to colorless dust. As the pale sun climbed into the sky, it offered no warmth or comfort, only a cold, anesthetic light that revealed the full extent of the horror. Nearly every house lay silent. No smoke curled from chimneys. No footsteps disturbed the stillness of the main street. The pumpkins that had once decorated the square were sunken and deflated, rotting from the inside. The twisted cornstalks and wilted wheat fields now formed a stark, gray forest of death around the village borders. Among them, the living darkness, having gorged on the spirit of Maplewick, sank into the ground. The shadows melted away with the dawn, no longer needing to prowl in visible form. They had done their work thoroughly, leaving behind a scene of absolute desolation. For a moment it seemed as if the wind itself died, leaving an otherworldly hush. In that hush, the nature of the shadows became chillingly clear. They were a harvest of their own, a harvest of souls, reaped in the same season the villagers had celebrated with song and cider. Now the fields and the village stood barren, as if the cycle had come full circle in a twisted, malicious reflection. With the final shift of the dark shapes into the soil, the morning found Maplewick a place without life, a graveyard missing the grace of proper burial. An hour past sunrise, a solitary traveler arrived by the northern road. He was a peddler named Rowley, leading a tired mare and cart. He had been looking forward to the famed pies of Maplewick, hoping to sell ribbons, needles, and spices for the harvest feast he had heard so much about in neighboring towns. What he saw at the edge of the fields made his blood run cold. Rows of dead crops, white and brittle, formed a ghostly barrier between him and the first cottages. The silence was thicker than any fog. Slowly, heart pounding in his ears, Rowley guided his cart forward. "Hello," he called, unsure if he even wished for a reply. No voice answered, though something in the emptiness seemed to stir. He pressed on, eventually reaching the center of the village square. There, the burned-out bonfire pit stood, scattered with ashes of the feast that had once been. Pieces of tables and broken chairs lay strewn about. Tattered banners clung to posts, fluttering weakly. Rowley's mare snorted uneasily, ears pinned back. The peddler's breath caught in his throat when he discovered the first body, a frail, gray-skinned figure curled around a collapsed stool. And then another and another. All bore the same sign, drained, as if life had been siphoned off. The once jovial scene of celebration had become a macabre tableau that mocked the notion of harvest bounty. Horror-stricken, Rowley backed away, head spinning with disbelief. His mare stamped nervously, sensing the lingering aura of dread. It was then he noticed something on the ground, faint stains of pitch-black shadow, like dried ink splotches leading away from the bodies. They seemed to trace a path across the withered fields, culminating in a swirling pattern that extended far into the distance. A shiver prickled the nape of Rowley's neck. He felt an instinctual fear, as if an invisible presence weighed heavily on him, assessing whether there was still more to harvest. Without daring to spend another moment in that blighted place, he seized the mare's reins and sped out of Maplewick, leaving behind the silent, shriveled corpses. Beyond the village, the road stretched into a wood that was ablaze with autumn colors, yet even that felt tainted now, as if the darkness from Maplewick stretched its influence far beyond. In his frantic retreat, Rowley never once looked back, too terrified of what he might see following at his heels. No one ever truly pieced together the final moments of Maplewick's villagers. Word of the tragedy spread in whispers, carried by a few travelers like Rowley, who recounted the dreadful tale in hushed voices at inns and taverns. Many who heard it dismissed it as a wild rumor or a cautionary tale, suspecting plague or famine or madness. But those who dared investigate discovered the truth soon enough. They found only withered corpses, empty shells where once a thriving community had stood. Investigators, priests, and merchants alike reported the same quiet hush, the same sense of being watched by something unseen. The farmland remained barren and unusable, choked with the memory of the shadows. Strangely, the stories said that on certain nights, especially in late autumn, eerie shapes could be glimpsed under the moonlight. These restless shades drifted among the skeletal cornfields, as if continuing some dreadful dance. Some travelers heard muted echoes of a fiddle's tune, or laughter that turned to moans in the rustling wind. Thus, Maplewick became a forbidden place, a footnote in local lore, a cradle of nightmares. A few fearless souls or foolhardy adventurers occasionally tried to reclaim its farmland, seeking to restore the deserted village to life. But each attempt ended in an unexplainable dread that drove them away after only a night or two. They spoke of seeing shadows move in corners of their vision, hearing faint whispers in empty rooms. It was as if the darkness had made Maplewick its permanent dwelling. Over time, the world moved on, forgetting Maplewick except as a whispered ghost story told around flickering campfires on harvest nights. Parents warned their children never to venture into cursed land. Elders nodded gravely, speaking of dark forces that feed on mortal spirit. Yet the world's memory is short, and as generations passed, the name Maplewick faded into an obscurity that only the truly superstitious or the deeply curious might unearth. And still, beyond the village's rotting fences, the fields remain. The orchard's twisted trees stand like petrified sentinels, the ground littered with ancient, blackened fruit. In the decaying huts, the furniture rots and crumbles, spiderwebs draping every corner. It is silent but not peaceful, for in that silence, one can sense a latent hunger, an echo of that living darkness that once crept through every furrow. The harvest that Maplewick had so joyfully gathered turned on them in the most bitter fashion, as though nature herself had reversed her bounty. Those who had offered thanks for the earth's gifts had become the final tribute in a ceremony of unseen terrors. No watchers, no guardians remain to stand against it. Only the hushed shadows shift and pulse in memory of the feast they devoured. If the wind picks up just right, one might even hear a distant fiddle note, part lament, part invocation, a final, unending elegy to the harvest of shadows. So ends the tale of Maplewick, where autumn's splendor once promised warmth, camaraderie, and the fruits of the land. In its stead came the darkest reaping imaginable. By the time a new generation dared wander close again, nothing lived amid those crumbling buildings. The well was choked with dead leaves and black mold. The farmland lay cracked and infertile. Here, on every signpost or fence, the shadows left their mark, an inky residue that defied the cleansing power of sun or rain. People who glimpsed it reported a numbness in their hearts, an unshakable dread that hounded them in dreams. In the end, there was no grand lesson for humanity, no heroic last stand. The villagers, in their innocence, had done nothing to invite this fate. It simply came, as unpredictable as a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Or perhaps it was always there, waiting beyond the boundaries of the lamplight, drawn by the potency of life's essence at its zenith. And in the aftermath, the living shadows slipped back into the soil, leaving only a caution that even at the height of celebration, something malevolent may wait in the dark. And if you, dear reader, ever find yourself traveling a winding road through woodlands set aflame by autumn leaves, and you see a sign half buried in brambles reading Maplewick in faded letters, be warned. Let it remain a memory lost to time. Turn back or skirt wide. For the dark harvest has no end. It merely sleeps beneath that desolate earth, waiting for the chance to rise and feed again. The songs and laughter that once filled those barns may linger faintly, calling the unsuspecting traveler closer. But all that remains of Maplewick is dust, ruin, and echoes of nightmares. And if you venture too near, you may feel the chill of a shadow brushing against you, an ancient hunger stirring in the soil. The living darkness does not forget. It does not tire. It waits, patient as the grave, for the next harvest of souls. In this final warning lies the true horror. Maplewick was not special. It could have been any village, any community celebrating prosperity under an autumn sky. It happened there, and it can happen anywhere else. Perhaps tomorrow, or years from now, or never at all. The living shadows might remain dormant, satisfied for a time by the banquet they devoured, or they may slip quietly across the land to taste new spirits. No locks or walls can repel them. The only defense is vigilance, the single flicker of fear that keeps humanity from embracing the night too completely. Now, the name Maplewick echoes as a dire portent, marking the memory of a once vibrant place that vanished overnight into hushed oblivion, claimed by the harvest of shadows. And with that, the wind sighs through the vacant fields, whispering a final lament for those lost souls. A lullaby of shadows that not even the dawn can dispel.